12,000 pounds of force. That is the upper estimate for the bite of an adult Tyrannosaurus rex. A single closure of the jaw capable of shattering bone the way a hydraulic press flattens sheet metal. It exceeds the bite of a modern lion by a wide margin, exceeds a spotted hyena, exceeds even the great white shark, and stands as close to the ceiling of what a terrestrial vertebrate jaw has ever produced in the entire 400 million year history of animals with backbones. And yet, the animal carrying that weapon spent the overwhelming majority of its adult life not using it on anything capable of fighting back. The chemistry of its own skeleton argues against the image most people carry of this creature: the sprinting, roaring, relentless killer running down terrified prey across an open floodplain. The bones tell a slower, stranger, more calculated story. A story about smell arriving before sight, about patience arriving before speed, about a 9-ton body that could end almost anything in its ecosystem in under a second, but that mostly walked, mostly waited, and mostly let the ecosystem come to it. Begin with the jaw itself, because the number 12,000 pounds needs context before it means anything. That estimate comes from biomechanical reconstructions built using the geometry of the skull, the cross-sectional area of the jaw musculature inferred from muscle attachment scars on fossilized bone, and comparisons against living archosaurs whose bite force can actually be measured with a sensor. Different research teams working from different modeling assumptions have produced numbers ranging from roughly 8,000 pounds at the low end to figures north of 12,000 at the high end for the rearmost teeth, where the mechanical advantage of the jaw is greatest. Even the conservative end of that range still leaves Tyrannosaurus with more raw bite force than any other terrestrial predator known from the fossil record. The teeth built to deliver that force were not blades. Unlike the narrow, laterally compressed, steak knife teeth of earlier large theropods such as Allosaurus, adult Tyrannosaurus teeth were thick, rounded in cross-section, reinforced with a dense enamel structure, closer in engineering terms to a railroad spike than to a knife. Bite marks recovered on fossilized bone from multiple prey species show not clean slicing wounds, but deep punctures, and in several documented cases, actual bone fragments swallowed and later expelled in fossilized dung show that the bite was strong enough to fracture solid bone rather than simply tear through the flesh surrounding it. This is a jaw purpose-built for one specific mechanical problem: crushing through the dense outer layer of another animal's skeleton to reach the softer, more caloric tissue and marrow underneath. It is not the jaw of an animal optimized for a quick, efficient kill delivered to soft tissue. It is the jaw of an animal optimized to process an entire carcass down to the bone, extracting every possible calorie, regardless of whether that carcass had been freshly killed or had been lying in the sun for 2 days. Now set that jaw against the limbs attached to the same body, because the mismatch only grows stranger the closer you look. On a fully grown adult, the forelimbs measured somewhere in the range of 3 feet from shoulder to claw tip, mounted on a body that stood roughly 12 to 13 feet tall at the hip and stretched over 40 feet from snout to tail tip. Proportionally, relative to total body length, these are the shortest forelimbs of any large-bodied theropod dinosaur yet described, shorter even than the earlier, smaller tyrannosauroids from which the lineage descended, meaning the arms did not simply fail to keep pace with the growth of the rest of the body. They were actively reduced across evolutionary time even as body size increased. The 2 clawed digits on each hand could not reach each other across the chest, could not reach the mouth, and current biomechanical analysis of the shoulder and elbow joints suggests a fairly limited range of motion overall, more consistent with a bracing or stabilizing function than with grasping, wrestling, or pinning a struggling animal. Whatever role those arms played in the animal's life, active predation in the traditional sense, grappling prey at close range the way a modern big cat uses its forelimbs, was mechanically unavailable to it. Every ounce of physical engagement with prey, living or dead, ran through the head, the neck, and the jaw alone. The skull interior adds a third data point that rarely receives the attention it deserves. Computed tomography scans of fossilized Tyrannosaurus braincases, reconstructing the shape and volume of the brain and its associated sensory structures from the internal contours of the skull, consistently show olfactory bulbs, the paired structures responsible for processing airborne scent, occupying a disproportionately large share of total brain volume, a ratio that sits closer to modern turkey vultures and other obligate carrion specialists than to pursuit predators like wolves or big cats. This does not mean Tyrannosaurus smelled the way a vulture smells, riding thermal currents and scanning kilometers of terrain from altitude. It means the neural investment in scent processing was substantial enough that detecting decomposition, blood, or other chemical signatures of a carcass at meaningful distance was almost certainly part of its everyday sensory experience, layered on top of, not instead of, genuinely capable vision and hearing. The eye sockets were positioned with enough forward rotation to grant a real, if partial, degree of binocular overlap, giving the animal usable depth perception for objects in front of it. An inner ear canal geometry suggests reasonably sharp, low-frequency hearing, potentially tuned toward detecting the kind of ground-transmitted vibration or low rumbling calls other large animals might produce. Sight and sound were not weak points in this animal's sensory profile. Smell was simply unusually dominant among them, and an animal does not carry that kind of neural investment in a single sense unless that sense was regularly paying off. Beneath all of that sits the skeleton responsible for actually moving several tons of muscle and bone from one part of the landscape to another. And here the popular image collides most directly with the physics. Documentaries have spent decades showing Tyrannosaurus at a full sprint, closing the gap on fleeing prey in a matter of seconds, jaws open, tail streaming behind it for balance. Biomechanical modeling built from limb bone cross sections, estimated muscle mass, and center of mass calculations tells a more restrained story for a fully grown adult. The femur, the single largest weight bearing bone in the body, is thick and dense in a way that prioritizes the ability to carry roughly 8 to 9 tons of mass across sustained distances without structural failure, rather than the lighter, more elastic, fast twitch oriented limb architecture seen in genuinely fast sprinting animals. Estimates of adult top speed produced by multiple independent research groups, using different modeling techniques, have clustered in a range from roughly 10 to 25 miles per hour, with several of the more recent and more conservative biomechanical models favoring the lower half of that range once the risk of bone failure under dynamic loading is factored into the equation. That is meaningfully faster than a walking human, but it is not fast set against the animals sharing its ecosystem. Edmontosaurus, among the most common large herbivores available to an adult Tyrannosaurus as potential prey, has itself been estimated at broadly comparable or even somewhat higher sustained running speeds by researchers modeling hadrosaur limb mechanics, and unlike a 9-ton biped balancing an enormous skull on a comparatively short, muscular neck, a fleeing hadrosaur risked far less catastrophic consequence from an awkward stride on uneven ground. For the Tyrannosaur, a trip at speed was not a stumble to be shaken off. It was potentially a fractured limb, and in an apex predator with no natural enemies of its own to fear, a fractured limb was not a temporary setback. It was, in practical terms, a slow death sentence delivered through infection, starvation, or simple inability to continue feeding itself during the weeks or months such an injury would take to heal, assuming it healed at all. None of these individual facts proves anything definitively on its own. Taken together, they sketch the outline of an animal whose entire physical architecture was built around risk management on a scale most predators never have to consider. An apex weapon system wrapped around a body that could not easily absorb the cost of using that weapon carelessly. Untangling what that combination actually meant for its day-to-day behavior requires walking through one of the longest running, most genuinely contested debates in vertebrate paleontology, a debate that has shifted meaningfully over the past 3 decades as new fossil evidence has accumulated from multiple directions at once. The debate has a name most people who have spent time around dinosaur documentaries will recognize on sight: the scavenger hypothesis, most closely associated with the paleontologist Jack Horner, who argued across several decades of research and public writing that Tyrannosaurus rex functioned primarily, and in his strongest formulations, almost exclusively, as an opportunistic scavenger rather than an active predator. Horner's case rested on precisely the anatomical evidence already on the table: forelimbs too short and too limited in range of motion to assist in subduing struggling prey, olfactory architecture disproportionately weighted toward long-range scent detection rather than close-range pursuit tracking, leg proportions and estimated top speeds that fell well short of many potential prey species sharing the same environment. Horner extended the argument further, pointing to the relatively large eye sockets and forward vision as tools better suited to spotting a stationary or already downed carcass from a distance, than to tracking the erratic movement of fleeing prey, and drawing comparisons to modern obligate and near obligate scavengers, whose sensory and locomotor profiles echo several of these same traits. The counterargument does not dispute Horner's anatomical observations. It disputes the conclusion drawn from them, and it does so using a comparison that undercuts the entire premise of treating hunting and scavenging as mutually exclusive categories in the first place. Modern lions scavenge extensively whenever the opportunity presents itself, displacing hyenas and cheetahs from fresh kills whenever the physical size differential favors theft over the risk of an original hunt. And no serious researcher argues that this behavior makes lions something other than predators. Spotted hyenas, popularly imagined as pure scavengers, in fact make the majority of their own kills through active group hunting, with scavenging supplementing rather than replacing that primary strategy. Across the entire modern terrestrial predator guild, genuinely obligates scavenging, an animal that exclusively eats carrion and never itself kills, is exceptionally rare, largely because reliably finding sufficient carrion to sustain a large body is a far more precarious way to make a living than the popular imagination assumes. There is no obvious reason a late Cretaceous floodplain would have reliably produced enough naturally dying, already dead megafauna on any given week to sustain a population of 9-ton predators through discovery alone, without any supplementation through active killing. The caloric economics sharpen this point considerably once actual numbers enter the picture rather than general intuition. Estimates of daily caloric requirement for an animal in the 8 to 9 ton range, built from comparative metabolic scaling models bridging modern reptiles and modern large mammals, place adult Tyrannosaurus energy needs at a level requiring the equivalent of several hundred pounds of meat consumed across a period of days to weeks between substantial meals, depending on where within the ongoing debate over dinosaur metabolic rate a given model falls. Chasing a healthy, alert, fully grown Edmontosaurus across open or broken terrain represented a specific kind of gamble under those constraints. A caloric expenditure with no guaranteed return, and a non-zero risk of an injury capable of ending the animal's ability to hunt again for an extended stretch, at exactly the moment its caloric needs would remain unchanged, or increase during recovery. Every unsuccessful pursuit was calories spent and recovered from nothing. Every pursuit ending in physical injury carried consequences disproportionate to what the same injury would mean for a smaller, lighter carnivore with a faster recovery curve and a lower baseline caloric requirement. For a 9-ton adult already operating close to the structural ceiling of what two-legged terrestrial locomotion could support, reckless pursuit of dangerous, healthy, fully grown prey was not simply inadvisable. It was frequently the losing move in the underlying economic calculation the animal's own body was constantly running. And yet the fossil record refuses to let the pure scavenger interpretation stand either. because it preserves something that carrion feeding categorically cannot produce: direct evidence of survival after an attack. This is the single most important category of evidence in the entire debate, and it deserves to be walked through carefully rather than simply asserted. A scavenger biting into an already dead carcass leaves bite marks in bone that show no biological response whatsoever, because dead bone does not remodel itself in reaction to trauma. A predator that attacks a living animal and fails to complete the kill, prey that survives the encounter and continues living for weeks, months, or in some documented cases, years afterward, leaves behind something categorically different. New bone tissue laid down around the site of the injury, a biological repair process visible under magnification and, in some cases, visible to the naked eye, a permanent physical record that the wound was inflicted while the animal was alive. Multiple specific specimens carry exactly this signature. Triceratops fossils have been recovered with tooth mark damage to the bony frill and to individual tail vertebrae, matched in spacing and tooth cross-section geometry to Tyrannosaurus dentition, and in several well-documented cases, the damage shows clear evidence of healing and bone remodeling around the injury site, meaning the animal was bitten, survived the encounter, and carried the healed scar as a permanent feature of its skeleton for the remainder of its life. Edmontosaurus material provides an even more specific and widely cited case. A caudal vertebra recovered from an Edmontosaurus annectens individual shows a partially healed puncture wound consistent in spacing with Tyrannosaurus tooth dimensions, surrounded by new bone growth indicating the animal survived the attack for a substantial period, before eventually dying from unrelated or compounding causes entirely separate from the injury itself. This is direct physical evidence of an active attack against a living, mobile, actively defended animal, an attack that failed to produce an immediate kill, after which the intended prey walked away and continued living. Carrion cannot generate this kind of evidence under any circumstances. Only genuine predation, successful or not, can. Skeletal specimens of Tyrannosaurus itself add a further, more unsettling layer to the picture, because several well-preserved individuals show healed injuries consistent not with prey defending itself, but with combat against other tyrannosaurs. Bite marks matching tyrannosaur tooth spacing and geometry have been documented on the skulls and jaws of multiple specimens, in several cases showing clear signs of healing, suggesting these animals survived close-range confrontations with members of their own species, whether through territorial disputes, competition over a kill, or some other form of intraspecific conflict. The fossil record cannot fully resolve. Fossilized dung recovered from late Cretaceous deposits and attributed on the basis of size and content to a large tyrannosaurid provides a final striking piece of physical evidence. Specimens containing fragments of crushed bone from a juvenile ornithischian, digested and passed through the gut, offering direct proof that at least some meals consisted of bone-crushing consumption of another dinosaur's body. Though the fossilized dung itself carries no information about whether that particular meal began as an active kill or a discovered carcass. Together, this body of evidence does not resolve into a clean single answer. It resolves into a portrait of an animal whose feeding behavior spanned active predation against large defended herbivores, opportunistic consumption of already dead carcasses, aggressive competition with other members of its own species over food, and a bite and hold or bite and release engagement style, dictated entirely by the mechanical limitations of arms too short to grapple with anything at all. That flexibility becomes considerably more pronounced and considerably more interesting once the discussion moves beyond treating Tyrannosaurus rex as a single fixed set of adult behaviors and instead accounts for the dramatically different physical animal it was at earlier stages of its own life. A phenomenon researchers refer to as ontogenetic niche partitioning, where an organism occupies a functionally different ecological role at different points across its own individual lifespan. A juvenile Tyrannosaurus did not resemble a small version of its parents in the way a wolf pup resembles a small adult wolf. Fossil specimens representing younger individuals generally interpreted as animals within roughly the first decade of life, prior to the onset of the species' characteristic growth spurt, show a body plan measurably more lightly built than the adult form, with proportionally longer, more slender hind limbs relative to overall body mass, a shallower and more blade-shaped tooth structure closer in profile to the laterally compressed cutting teeth of earlier, smaller theropods than to the thick, rounded, bone-crushing teeth that would eventually replace them as the animal matured. This is not a cosmetic distinction. It represents a fundamentally different physical toolkit. A juvenile tyrannosaur, weighing only a small fraction of eventual adult mass, carried dramatically less structural risk with every stride, could plausibly achieve meaningfully higher relative running speeds, and could change direction with a degree of agility that would become biomechanically impossible for the same individual a decade later, once its body mass had increased by more than an order of magnitude. Bone histology work, thin sectioning fossilized limb bones, and counting the annual growth rings preserved within them, functionally identical to counting rings in a cross section of tree trunk, has revealed just how extraordinary that later transformation actually was. Growth curve reconstructions built from multiple specimens across a range of known or estimated ages show Tyrannosaurus passing through a period of extraordinarily rapid growth during adolescence, with some estimates placing peak growth velocity at more than 4 pounds of new body mass added per day during the fastest years of that adolescent growth spurt, a rate of increase almost without parallel among terrestrial vertebrates living or extinct. An individual tyrannosaur could move from a lean, fast, agile juvenile form to something approaching adult mass and adult bone proportions within a relatively narrow span of years. A transformation dramatic enough that, for decades, some juvenile and subadult specimens were classified as an entirely separate genus before more complete growth. Series analysis demonstrated they represented immature Tyrannosaurus individuals rather than a distinct smaller species occupying the same ecosystem. A taxonomic debate that in certain corners of the paleontological community continues in modified form to this day. The behavioral implication of this growth trajectory is significant because it means the same species was functionally hunting two, or arguably three, entirely different menus depending on the age of the individual doing the hunting. Smaller, faster, more maneuverable prey items, young or smaller bodied ornithischians, juvenile individuals of larger herbivore species, animals that a 9-ton adult could never realistically hope to run down through direct pursuit, were plausibly within reach of a fast juvenile or subadult tyrannosaur, relying primarily on speed and agility rather than raw crushing power. As the animal aged into its final years and approached the 8 to 9-ton adult range, that pursuit-based strategy stopped being biomechanically available, closed off by exactly the same bone strength scaling problem constraining every other large terrestrial biped. Mass increases with the cube of an animal's linear dimensions. Double the linear size of an animal and its total mass increases roughly 8-fold, while the cross-sectional strength of a supporting limb bone increases only with the square of that same linear dimension, roughly 4-fold for an identical doubling. This mismatch between how fast mass accumulates and how fast supporting bone strength can keep pace means every large terrestrial animal eventually confronts a structural ceiling where further increases in size demand disproportionately thicker, heavier, less mechanically efficient limb bones, simply to avoid outright failure under the animal's own weight, and Tyrannosaurus femora from the largest known adult specimens show precisely this kind of disproportionate reinforcement, consistent with an animal operating close to the outer edge of what bipedal terrestrial locomotion could physically sustain. The adult body, no longer able to rely on pursuit, increasingly resembles an ambush and power specialist, an animal built to close a short final distance using patience and positioning rather than sustained speed. Then end the encounter through a single overwhelming application of that 12,000-pound bite, rather than a prolonged chase, Alternatively, and just as plausibly given the surrounding ecosystem, the adult body plan reads as built for intimidation and physical displacement, an animal that did not need to outrun a kill already made by a smaller theropod competitor, sharing the same territory. Because raw size and the implied threat of that bite made direct confrontation an unnecessary formality most of the time. Kleptoparasitism, the outright theft of a kill already made by another predator, is extensively documented across the modern terrestrial predator guild, wherever a meaningful size differential exists between two carnivorous species occupying overlapping territory. And there is no clear biological reason to assume an adult Tyrannosaurus, sharing its late Cretaceous ecosystem with several genera of smaller theropods, would have behaved fundamentally differently. This possibility folds the hunting versus scavenging framing back on itself one more time. An adult stealing a fresh kill from a smaller predator is, in one sense, scavenging, since it did not itself perform the dangerous work of the original hunt. It is simultaneously an act of active predation in every meaningful sense, since it involves the direct, forceful displacement of a living competitor through threat and physical dominance rather than the passive discovery of an abandoned carcass. The clean categories that hold up so easily in a documentary voiceover dissolve almost completely once the full range of available adult behaviors is actually accounted for. The physical mechanics underlying that adult caution deserve one further layer of detail, because they explain precisely why an 8 to 9 ton bipedal body would have consistently favored these lower risk feeding strategies over sustained active pursuit. Standing at roughly 8 to 9 tons distributed across two legs rather than four, an adult Tyrannosaurus operated near the outer edge of what any known bipedal terrestrial animal, living or extinct, has ever demonstrated the capacity to support. Biomechanical modeling of bone stress under dynamic loading, the kind of force experienced during running, sudden directional changes, or a fall, has repeatedly emphasized just how narrow the safety margin actually was for an animal this size, moving at anything approaching its estimated top speed. A trip on uneven or unstable ground, a misjudged step during a sudden turn, a stumble while pursuing prey across broken terrain carried a category of structural risk for a 9-ton adult that simply did not apply to the same individual a decade earlier, when its body mass sat at a fraction of that eventual figure. Every unnecessary physical risk taken by the mature adult was, in the most literal biomechanical sense, a gamble the skeleton itself could not consistently afford to lose. And the entire behavioral profile that emerges from the anatomical evidence, patient, selective, favoring overwhelming force over sustained chase, willing to scavenge, willing to displace a smaller competitor rather than hunt independently, reserving genuine pursuit for the rare situations where prey was young, isolated, injured, or otherwise unusually vulnerable, reads as the direct behavioral consequence of a body that had, quite literally, outgrown its own earlier capacity for physical recklessness. All of which sets up what happened next as one of the more quietly devastating footnotes in this entire story, because the very specialization that made the adult form so formidable within a stable, functioning ecosystem became, on a geological timescale measured in months rather than millennia, close to a fatal liability the moment that ecosystem stopped functioning. The Chicxulub impact, striking the Yucatan Peninsula roughly 66 million years ago, did not kill primarily through the immediate blast, heat, and tsunami of the initial event. Catastrophic as that first wave of destruction certainly was across the surrounding region. The longer, slower, and ultimately far more consequential killer arrived afterward, in the form of pulverized rock and sulfate aerosols lofted into the upper atmosphere, blocking incoming sunlight across the entire planet for an extended period, collapsing photosynthetic productivity on both land and in the oceans, and triggering a cascading failure that rippled upward through every successive trophic level of the global food web. Herbivore populations, entirely dependent on a plant base that had just lost its ability to regenerate under a darkened, rapidly cooling sky, would have experienced catastrophic population collapse within a span of months rather than years, long before any meaningful ecological recovery could begin. An apex predator sitting at the very top of a rapidly shrinking food pyramid, requiring an enormous and consistent caloric intake simply to maintain its own body mass day to day, occupied precisely the most exposed and least resilient position in that entire collapsing structure. This pattern is not unique to the specific circumstances of the end Cretaceous extinction. It recurs across the broader history of Earth's major extinction events, with enough consistency that paleontologists treat it as a general principle. Large-bodied, highly specialized apex predators tend to be disproportionately represented among the earliest casualties of any sudden, severe ecological disruption, while smaller, lower metabolism, dietary generalists tend to be disproportionately represented among the eventual survivors on the other side. The underlying mathematics of caloric need explains why this pattern repeats so reliably. A small opportunist, requiring a comparatively modest daily caloric intake relative to its own body mass, can persist for an extended period on a scattered, unreliable, drastically reduced food supply, surviving on insects, seeds, decaying plant matter, or scavenged scraps that would represent an insignificant fraction of what a much larger animal requires simply to avoid catabolizing its own muscle tissue for energy. A 9-ton apex predator possesses no comparable buffer. It cannot meaningfully reduce its caloric requirements to match a food web that has collapsed by a large majority within a single year. And it cannot simply wait out a temporarily bad season the way a smaller, more metabolically modest animal can. Every adaptation that had made the adult form so dominant within a functioning late Cretaceous ecosystem, the enormous size, the specialized crushing bite, the sustained metabolic demands of maintaining that much continuously active tissue, became, almost overnight in geological terms, precisely the wrong set of tools for a world in which reliable prey and reliable carrion had both become severely and simultaneously scarce. The lineages that persisted through that bottleneck and into the following geological age were, disproportionately and measurably, the small-bodied and the dietarily flexible. Surviving mammalian lineages skewed heavily towards small size and generalist feeding strategies capable of exploiting whatever marginal food sources remained available even in a badly damaged ecosystem. Among the dinosaur lineage's own closest surviving relatives, the birds, research into fossilized beak and jaw morphology across the extinction boundary has pointed towards seed eating as a particularly advantageous dietary strategy during the extended period of collapsed plant productivity that followed the impact. Since dormant seeds represented one of the few concentrated storable food sources capable of persisting through an extended stretch of reduced sunlight in a way that fresh vegetation simply could not, the specialization that had made adult Tyrannosaurus the single most dominant terrestrial predator its own ecosystem had ever produced offered it no meaningful protection whatsoever against a crisis defined not by competition, not by predation, not by any of the pressures its anatomy had spent its entire evolutionary history refining itself against, but by the sudden, near total, and simultaneous absence of food across every level of the food web at once. Being the best equipped hunter and opportunist within a healthy, functioning ecosystem, and being equipped to survive the wholesale collapse of that ecosystem, turned out to be almost entirely separate problems, governed by almost entirely separate sets of physical constraints. And Tyrannosaurus, for all the sophistication built into its anatomy across millions of years of refinement, had only ever been optimized to solve the first one. What remains, once all of this evidence has been laid out and weighed against itself, is not a tidy resolution arriving at a single confident label. It is a genuinely open set of questions that current fossil evidence has not fully settled, and in at least one important respect, may never be able to settle with complete confidence given the physical realities of what does and does not survive 66 million years of geological time. The healed bite marks on Triceratops and Edmontosaurus prove that active predation against large, dangerous living prey genuinely happened. The underlying caloric economics argue that active predation against large, dangerous, healthy adult prey would have carried a cost profile a mature adult could not afford to accept routinely, making it a strategy reserved for situations where the odds were unusually favorable rather than a default daily behavior. The ontogenetic evidence demonstrates that this same species was, in a very real functional sense, 2 or 3 different predators across the span of a single individual lifetime. Its available strategies reshaped continuously by its own changing anatomy. And sitting beneath all of that remains a question current evidence genuinely cannot resolve with confidence in either direction. Whether adult Tyrannosaurus rex hunted, at least under certain circumstances, in some form of loose cooperative grouping, or whether it operated as a fundamentally solitary animal for whom the caloric math of sharing even an easy kill with another individual of its own size and its own bite force simply never made economic sense. The evidence bearing on this specific question pulls in genuinely different directions depending on which fossil sites carry the most interpretive weight. Bonebed sites containing the remains of multiple individual large tyrannosaurids of varying age classes, recovered together in a single stratigraphic layer, have been documented in more than one location across Western North America, including sites associated with close relatives of Tyrannosaurus, such as Albertosaurus in what is now Alberta, where a bone bed containing multiple individuals spanning a range of ages has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence of loose social grouping, potentially even coordinated group behavior among related individuals moving together across the landscape. Other researchers studying the same or comparable sites have urged caution, noting that multiple individuals recovered together in a single flood deposit or similar catastrophic burial event does not, on its own, prove those individuals were traveling together immediately prior to death. Since a mass mortality event at a shared water source or similar resource during a period of environmental stress could produce an outwardly similar bone bed without any meaningful social behavior involved at all. Trackway evidence from a small number of sites has occasionally been read as showing multiple large theropods moving across the same surface in the same general direction within a short window of time, though the sample size available for this kind of analysis remains small enough that confident conclusions about coordinated hunting behavior specifically, as opposed to simple parallel movement through a shared landscape, remain difficult to draw from the trackway record alone. If adult Tyrannosaurus did hunt cooperatively under at least some circumstances, it would help resolve a meaningful part of the energy paradox running through this entire debate. Since a group of individuals bringing down a single large, dangerous, high-calorie prey animal, such as an adult Triceratops, spreads both the physical risk of the encounter and the caloric reward of its outcome across multiple animals at once, potentially tipping an otherwise unfavorable cost-benefit calculation for any single individual into a favorable one for the group as a whole. But that possibility raises an immediate and genuinely unresolved problem of its own directly behind it. An animal capable of delivering roughly 12,000 pounds of bite force to living tissue, sharing a kill or a hunting effort with another individual of the same species carrying an identical weapon, represents a fundamentally different and considerably higher stakes social proposition than a pack of wolves sharing a carcass using far more modest bite mechanics and correspondingly lower potential for a routine dispute over feeding priority to escalate into a genuinely lethal encounter between the two animals involved. Whether the caloric benefit of occasional cooperative hunting among adult Tyrannosaurus individuals meaningfully outweighed the very real risk of catastrophic injury inherent in any dispute with another 9-ton animal carrying the same bone crushing jaw is a question the currently available fossil record has not resolved. And it may ultimately be one of those questions where the specific behavioral evidence required to settle it definitively was simply never the kind of thing likely to survive the fossilization process in the first place, leaving the debate to rest indefinitely on inference, comparative anatomy, and educated argument rather than direct proof in either direction. That is where this one has to be left for now. Not with a clean, closed answer, but with a real animal, shaped by real physics and real caloric constraint, whose day-to-day existence across the final years of its life was almost certainly a constant, shifting negotiation between the raw, destructive potential concentrated in its jaw and the very real physical limits governing the rest of its body. An apex predator that was also across a significant fraction of its adult existence, something closer to a patient, calculating opportunist. A solitary giant that may, under at least some circumstances the fossil record has not yet fully clarified, have needed help. If you have a theory about which side of that balance the current evidence actually favors, and where the next fossil discovery is most likely to finally tip it one way or the other, that argument belongs exactly where these debates have always played out best. In the comment section below, where the case is still genuinely open.